Arthur Vance, a man whose life was measured in miles and regrets, steered his colossal rig into the familiar grimy truck stop. The late-night air hung heavy, thick with the scent of diesel and the promise of stale coffee. He sought only a quiet booth, a steaming mug, and the blessed anonymity of the endless road. Inside the bustling diner, a symphony of clanking plates and low chatter filled the space. Art settled into his usual corner booth, his gaze drifting. His eyes, accustomed to scanning endless highways, caught on a young waitress. She moved with a weary grace, a blur of efficiency amidst the chaos. As she cleared the table next to his, a crumpled, familiar-looking napkin peeked from her apron pocket, its corner just visible. A moment later, Clara, the waitress, leaned against the counter, her shoulders slumping. She pulled the napkin from her pocket, unfolding it gently to consult its contents. In that instant, the world seemed to tilt. Art's breath hitched in his throat, a sudden, sharp intake of air. It was a map, a crude, hand-drawn sketch of a small, forgotten town, complete with a winding creek and a distinctive old oak tree. Every line, every smudge was instantly, impossibly familiar. Time collapsed. 20 years melted away like ice on a summer road. He had drawn that map himself, painstakingly for his little girl Sarah, before he left. A guide to the only home she'd ever known. A promise he'd broken. How could this young woman, a stranger in a roadside diner, possess the very artifact of his deepest regret? A flicker of impossible hope ignited in his chest, warring with a raw, agonizing fear. Clara, sensing his intense, unblinking stare, glanced up, her eyes meeting his for a fleeting moment before she quickly, protectively, tucked the napkin back into her apron. Art Vance swallowed hard, the bitterness of the lukewarm coffee, a fitting match for the knot in his stomach. He tried to form the words, to phrase a casual question about the crumpled napkin that had so violently shaken his world, but they caught in his throat like rust. What if he was wrong? What if this was just a cruel coincidence, a trick of the mind worn down by endless miles and crushing regret? The fear of the truth, of shattering this fragile, impossible hope, was a heavy cloak. Clara returned, her movements fluid and efficient despite the late hour, refilling his mug with a practiced ease. Her smile, though tired, was genuine, a beacon in the diner's grimy glow, utterly oblivious to the storm raging within him. He watched her, searching for any flicker of resemblance, a familiar curve of the jaw, the tilt of an eyebrow, anything that would confirm the impossible. Back in the lonely confines of his truck cab, the rhythmic drumming of rain against the windshield did little to lull Art to sleep. His eyes, usually heavy with the fatigue of the road, were wide open, staring into the inky blackness beyond the glass. The map, that simple, crudely drawn napkin, burned behind his eyelids, each line a scar on his soul. He remembered the precise curve of the creek, the gnarled branches of the old oak, the tiny, makeshift bridge. He had drawn it for Lily, his sweet, bright-eyed Lily, 20 years ago. A promise. A guide to their secret fishing spot, a treasure map for a little girl who adored her daddy. The memory was a physical ache. He had been so young, so foolishly proud, convinced that leaving, that seeking his fortune on the open road, was the only way to provide. The shame of his poverty, the whispers from her mother's family, the feeling of being utterly inadequate, they had driven him away. The map, intended as a playful guide, had become a symbol of his greatest failure, a permanent record of the path he had abandoned. Miles away, in her small apartment above a bustling laundromat, Clara Bell collapsed onto her worn sofa. The scent of stale detergent and the distant rumble of washing machines were the lullabies of her life. Her feet throbbed, a familiar symphony of exhaustion from another double shift. She reached into her apron pocket, her fingers closing around the crumpled napkin. Unfolding it gently, she smoothed out the creases, her tired eyes tracing the faded lines. This map, a patchwork of squiggly roads and childishly drawn landmarks, was her only tangible link to the father she'd never known. Her mother, before she'd passed, had called him a traveling man, a dreamer who loved to draw. Clara sighed, a quiet, hopeful sound. "Whisper Creek," she murmured to the empty room, her voice soft but determined. "One day, I'll find you. One day, I'll find home. It was more than just a dream. It was the whispered promise of a past, a blueprint for a future that offered escape from the endless grind. The following night, against the ingrained habits of 2 decades, Art found himself pulling his rig back into the familiar truck stop. The diner's neon sign, a garish beacon in the gloom, called to him with an undeniable pull. He feigned hunger, ordering the same bland coffee and a slice of pie he barely touched. His gaze, however, was fixed on Clara. He noticed the almost imperceptible limp in her step, the way she instinctively clutched at the napkin tucked into her apron, a protective gesture he recognized. He tried to be subtle, to ask about her day, the weather, anything that might lead to a natural opening. "Busy night, huh?" he grunted, his voice raspier than usual. Clara offered a polite, tired smile. "Always is, sir. Keeps the lights on." Art felt a tug, a connection forming that went deeper than just a map. He had to know. Emboldened by a courage he hadn't felt in years, Art pushed a $20 bill across the counter. That drawing you have?" he began, trying to sound casual. "The one on the napkin. I collect old maps. Folk art, you know. I'd be willing to buy it from you." Clara's eyes, though tired, narrowed slightly. She instinctively covered the napkin with her hand. "Oh, this?" she said, a hint of defensiveness in her tone. "It's not for sale, sir. It's not just a drawing. It's everything I have of him." Her words, simple and heartfelt, struck Art like a physical blow. They resonated with a profound truth, a fierce protection of memory that he understood all too well. His own guilt, his own sentimental attachments he had buried for so long echoed in her voice. This wasn't a cheap trinket, this was priceless. As dawn painted the horizon in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, Art Vance was back on the road. But this time, his journey was different. He bypassed his usual turnoff, the familiar route that would take him further into the anonymity of the interstate. Instead, he steered his powerful rig down a smaller, less-traveled highway, a symbolic deviation from the life he had known. He couldn't leave. He wouldn't leave. Clara's refusal, her quiet conviction, had ignited a spark in his long-dormant heart. He had to know the truth about her, about the map, about the impossible connection he felt. His endless physical journey had ended. His true journey, an emotional quest to reclaim a lost piece of himself, had just begun. The San Francisco City Library hummed with a quiet industry of minds at work, a stark contrast to the roar of diesel engines Art usually navigated. He sat hunched over a dusty microfiche reader in a secluded corner, the faint smell of old paper and ozone filling his nostrils. His calloused fingers, more accustomed to the cold steel of a steering wheel, now meticulously scrolled through digitized county records. He was hunting for a ghost, a place etched into a napkin, Whisper Creek. It wasn't on any modern map, but after hours of painstaking searching through archival land surveys, he found it. A forgotten logging community, nestled deep in the redwood country, barely a speck on the map from 20 years ago. A place that had once been home. His heart hammered a rhythm against his ribs, a mix of apprehension and a fragile, terrifying hope. He was close, closer than he'd dared to dream. Now, to find a name. As twilight bled across the San Francisco sky, painting the bay in hues of bruised purple and deep orange, Art found himself on a secluded park bench. The city lights began to twinkle, a distant, glittering tapestry, but his gaze was fixed on the churning waters below, mirroring the turmoil within him. 20 years. 2 decades of regret, a lifetime of silence. He remembered the desperate circumstances that had driven him from Whisper Creek, from the woman he loved, from his little girl. The logging industry had collapsed, taking with it every scrap of his pride and dignity. He'd seen the fear in his wife's eyes, the unspoken accusation that he couldn't provide. The shame had been a physical weight, crushing him, telling him he was inadequate, a failure. It was easier, he had convinced himself, to disappear, to leave them unburdened by his presence. He had broken every promise, abandoning his family, trading love for the open road and the hollow comfort of solitude. The weight of that decision, a silent, festering wound, now throbbed with a pain as raw as the day he left. He was no better than Elenina's parents, he realized, though his currency had been shame, not social standing. Meanwhile, in her cramped apartment above the laundromat, Clara Bell was fighting her own battles. The early morning light filtered through the grimy window, illuminating a stack of eviction notices and overdue utility bills on her tiny kitchen table. Her shoulders ached, her feet throbbed, and the lingering scent of stale coffee and fried food clung to her uniform. She was exhausted, living on the thin edge of survival, constantly treading water against a tide of debt. She picked up the crumpled napkin, her fingers tracing the familiar, faded lines of the hand-drawn map. It was more than just a drawing. It was a whisper of escape, a tangible link to a past she yearned to uncover. Her mother had always spoken of the town with a wistful smile, a distant dream. Now for Clara, it represented a hope, however faint, for a life beyond the endless grind, a future where she wasn't constantly fighting to stay afloat. Later that night, nestled in the familiar steel cocoon of his truck cab, Art reached for a small, almost invisible latch beneath the dashboard. It clicked open, revealing a shallow compartment, a repository of the few treasures he had allowed himself to keep. Inside, tucked beneath a worn handkerchief, were a handful of faded photographs. He picked one up, his callous thumb gently tracing the image of a toddler with bright, curious eyes, clutching a miniature wooden toy truck. His Lily. His daughter. He remembered carving that tiny truck for her, the splinters in his fingers, the pure joy on her face. He held the photo, his gaze shifting to a mental image of Clara, the young waitress from the diner, the same determined set to her jaw, the same strength in her eyes, even in exhaustion. Could it be? Could this faded piece of his past be a mirror image of his impossible hope? The conviction, once a flicker, now burned with a steady, undeniable flame. In her quiet apartment, Clara held the napkin map, her thoughts drifting to her late mother. Her mother, who had been a whirlwind of fragmented memories and half-finished sentences, especially in her later years. But there were flashes, moments of clarity that always circled back to this map, to her father. "He was a traveling man, honey," her mother would sometimes whisper, her voice frail. "Loved to draw, he did. Said this map was his last gift, a guide home." Clara remembered the tenderness in her mother's voice, a longing that had always resonated deep within her own heart. The map wasn't just a curiosity. It was a promise, a beacon from a father she'd never known. These scattered memories, like distant stars, strengthened her resolve. She would follow this map. It was her only connection to him, her only path to understanding where she truly came from. The afternoon sun, usually a welcome guest, felt intrusive in Clara's small apartment above the laundromat. She was meticulously mending a tear in her uniform, her brow furrowed with concentration, when a sharp rap on the door announced a presence she both appreciated and dreaded. Her Uncle Silas, a man built like a sturdy oak, and with a disposition just as unyielding, filled the doorway. His gaze, though meant to convey concern, always landed with the weight of judgment. "Clara," he began, his voice a low rumble, "we need to talk about your situation. These diner wages aren't cutting it. I found you a stable position at the city records office. Good hours, benefits." He paused, his eyes falling on the crumpled napkin sticking out of her worn purse. "And frankly, it's time to put away this childish nonsense, this map." He gestured dismissively, as if swatting away a fly. Clara's shoulders sagged. His pragmatism, though born of a desire to help, always felt like a dismissal of her deepest hopes. From the shadowed interior of his idling truck, parked a discreet distance down the street, Vance watched the scene unfold. He saw the way Silas's imposing frame seemed to shrink Clara, the way her shoulders slumped under the weight of his advice. A familiar, protective anger, long dormant, surged within him. He recognized that look on Clara's face, the quiet resignation of someone carrying too much alone, a reflection of his own solitary journey. It wasn't just the map that tugged at him anymore. It was her. This young woman, a stranger, yet so profoundly connected to his buried past, was vulnerable, and he, Art, felt an undeniable, almost primal urge to shield her from a world that seemed intent on crushing her spirit. He clenched his jaw. He wouldn't let her face this alone. Later that night, the diner hummed with its usual cacophony of clanking plates and tired conversation. Art, nursing a lukewarm coffee at the counter, struck up a conversation with Bob, the diner manager, a man whose encyclopedic knowledge of local gossip was as vast as his waistline. "That young waitress, Clara," Art ventured, feigning casual interest. "She seems like a good kid," Bob grunted, wiping down the counter with a practiced hand. "Clara?" "Yeah, salt of the earth. Hard worker. Shame about her ma, passed a few years back. Left Clara with a mountain of bills and no one else. No father in the picture, never was. Just her and her mother. Tough as nails they were." He paused. "Got an uncle, though, Silas. Means well, but a bit much. Always pushing her to be practical. Poor kid just needs a break." Each detail, each casual word, struck Art like a hammer blow, confirming his deepening suspicion, solidifying the impossible truth. The next day found Art driving, not toward his next delivery, but into the forgotten heart of his past, Whisper Creek. The town, once a vibrant logging community, was now little more than overgrown paths and crumbling foundations, a testament to time's relentless march. He recognized the old general store, its windows boarded, and then, with a jolt that stopped his breath, the remains of his own small home, now a skeletal frame swallowed by weeds. He walked to the creek where he'd taught his little girl to skip stones, then to the majestic old oak tree, its branches still reaching skyward. This was it. Every line, every landmark on that napkin map was etched into his soul. He had drawn it for her, for his Lily, a guide to their small, perfect world, a world he had abandoned. The melancholic beauty of the ghost town mirrored the profound, aching loss in his own heart. As dusk settled over Whisper Creek, painting the skeletal trees in hues of bruised purple and orange, Art sat in his truck, the engine off, the silence profound. He clutched the faded photograph of his daughter, a tiny figure holding a toy truck, her eyes full of the innocence he had shattered. He could no longer run. The decades of regret, the quiet solitude of the road, the shame that had driven him away, it all coalesced into an unshakable resolve. He would face his past. He would tell Clara everything. The fear of her rejection was immense, a towering mountain, but the thought of leaving her to struggle alone, clinging to a map he had drawn, was unbearable. He had to be honest. Whatever the cost, he would finally give his daughter the truth, and perhaps a father. Arthur Vance sat hunched in the worn seat of his truck cab, the engine silent, the world outside a blur of daytime traffic he barely registered. Spread across his dashboard were several crumpled sheets of paper, each a failed attempt to articulate the confession that had festered in his soul for 2 decades. His calloused fingers, accustomed to the heavy grip of a steering wheel, now trembled as he held a pen, the ink bleeding slightly on the cheap diner napkin he'd salvaged. Asterisk Clara. Asterisk he'd written, then scratched out. Asterisk my daughter. Asterisk he'd tried, the words feeling too grand, too presumptuous for a man who had forfeited the right to speak them. He wanted to explain the desperation, the shame that had driven him from Whisper Creek, the gnawing guilt that had become his constant companion on the endless highways. But how could 20 years of regret, of unspoken love, be distilled into a few paltry lines? Each discarded draft was a testament to his fear, a mirror reflecting the vulnerable, terrified man he still was beneath the hardened exterior. The words felt inadequate, hollow. He couldn't write this. He had to face her. Miles away, in her small apartment, Clara Bell sat at her rickety kitchen table, the familiar napkin map smoothed out before her. The late evening light, filtered through the grimy window, cast long shadows across the page as she traced the crude lines with a thoughtful finger. Her mother's stories, fragmented and dreamlike, had always swirled around this map, hinting at a secret, a hidden message from the father she'd never known. Idly, her finger brushed against the old oak tree landmark, a spot her mother had often pointed to. There, barely discernible, a faint indentation, a tiny irregularity in the paper. It was almost invisible, a secret, etched with the lightest of touches. A secret sign. Her mother's frail voice echoed in her memory. Clara's breath caught. Grabbing a pencil, she gently rubbed the area, pressing down with deliberate care. Slowly, miraculously, a tiny, almost imperceptible engraving began to emerge from the paper fibers. A delicate, swirling AV. Her heart leaped into her throat, a sudden, exhilarating surge of excitement. This wasn't just a map. It was a coded message, a whispered truth hidden in plain sight. The initials, AV, pulsed in Clara's mind, a beacon in the fog of her past. She stood abruptly, her eyes darting around the small apartment, searching. Then she remembered, tucked away in a dusty shoebox beneath her bed, a relic from her mother's meager possessions, an old, tarnished pocket watch. Her hands trembled as she retrieved it, the cold metal a stark contrast to the warmth of her pounding heart. The glass face was cracked, the hands frozen at an arbitrary time, but on the back, etched in the same delicate swirling script as the map, were the identical initials, AV, the world tilted on its axis. The map, the watch, her mother's fragmented memories. They weren't disparate pieces of a forgotten life. They were a unified tapestry, each thread leading to the same, singular truth. This wasn't just a fantasy anymore. This was a direct link to her bloodline, a tangible whisper from the father she had only ever dreamed of. A name. A real name. A.V., she whispered, the sound. A prayer. A revelation. The sun, a tired orange ball, began its slow descent, painting the city in hues of regret and possibility. Arthur Vance stood outside Clara's apartment building, his heart hammering against his ribs like a desperate fist against a locked door. He wore his cleanest work shirt, a faded blue that did little to hide the weariness etched around his eyes. In his calloused hand he clutched a small, worn wooden carving of a truck, painstakingly whittled for his daughter years ago, a piece of his soul he'd never dared to part with. This was it. No more letters. No more hiding. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the stale city air doing little to calm his racing pulse. 20 years, Art. 20 years you ran. Now you walk. He squared his shoulders, a silent pep talk echoing in the cavernous chambers of his guilt. His knuckles, raw from years of labor, rapped softly on the door, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet hallway. Clara, still reeling from the earth-shattering discovery of the initials, moved like a sleepwalker towards the insistent knock. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of possibility and apprehension. Who could it be? Julian Vance's men? Uncle Silas, returned for another lecture? She opened the door cautiously, a sliver of light from the hallway, illuminating the figure standing on her drab landing. It was the truck driver. The man from the diner, but he wasn't just a truck driver. He was a man with a nervous, hopeful gaze that seemed to pierce through her, an earnestness that spoke of profound vulnerability. A flicker of recognition, a gut feeling she couldn't explain, passed between them like an electrical current. His face, etched with lines of hardship and longing, held a strange familiarity, an echo of the face she'd only ever imagined. Unspoken questions hung heavy in the air, a tension so extreme it felt like the very fabric of time was stretching taut between them. Clara, still breathing shallowly, stepped back, allowing Art to enter the small, cluttered apartment. Her eyes, wide and searching, never left his face, trying to reconcile the weary truck driver with the image of a father she'd only ever dreamed of. Art, his own heart a frantic drumbeat against his ribs, moved hesitantly. He placed the small, worn wooden truck, the one he'd carved for his little girl so many years ago, on the worn formica table between them, his hands calloused and trembling clasped together. "That map," he began, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, thick with a lifetime of unspoken words and regret. "The one you carry. I drew that. For you." He looked directly into her eyes, the blue of them so achingly familiar, a mirror to a past he'd tried to bury. "My name is Arthur Vance, and I'm your father, Clara." The last words were barely a whisper, a confession and a plea, heavy with the weight of 2 decades of absence and the desperate hope for forgiveness. Clara stood frozen, the napkin map in one hand, the antique pocket watch in the other. Art's words, though expected in a way she hadn't dared to articulate, still crashed over her with the force of a physical blow. The crude lines of the map, the faint AV, her mother's fragmented whispers of a traveling man who loved to draw and left a guide home. Every disparate piece of her fractured past clicked into place with a sudden, overwhelming clarity. The truth settled over her, cold and profound, yet simultaneously warm with a desperate, impossible hope. She looked from the map to the man before her, her vision blurring, every fiber of her being struggling to process the impossible, undeniable reality. Art watched her, a silent, anxious sentinel, his gaze a mixture of fear and a fragile, burgeoning love. The dam broke. A choked sob escaped Clara's lips, raw and agonizing, followed by a torrent of tears that streamed down her face. 20 years of unspoken longing, of questions without answers, of a yearning for a father she'd never known, poured out in a visceral, heartbreaking release. Her knees buckled, and she sank onto the small sofa, clutching the map and watched to her chest as if they were life rafts. Art, his own eyes now glistening, moved gently, tentatively. He sat beside her, the worn cushions sagging under his weight, his large hand hovering, not daring to touch her, but his presence a silent, unwavering anchor in the storm of her grief. The small apartment, usually filled with the quiet hum of her struggle, was now thick with the raw, potent emotion of a reunion forged in sorrow and impossible hope. Slowly the sobs subsided, replaced by shuddering breaths. Clara pushed herself upright, her face blotchy and tear-streaked, but her eyes, though red, held a new, fierce clarity. "Why?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. The question she'd carried for a lifetime finally spoken aloud. "Why did you leave us?" It wasn't an accusation, but a plea for understanding, for the missing pieces of her mother's half-told stories. Art flinched, the question a fresh wound. He explained, his voice rough with remembered pain, the crushing weight of economic hardship, the suffocating shame of feeling he couldn't provide, the desperate, misguided belief that leaving was the only way to spare them his failure. Every day, he confessed, his gaze fixed on some distant, painful memory, every single day I've carried that ache. The ache of you being gone, my greatest regret. Art reached out, his calloused hand finally finding Clara's, a connection that felt both foreign and utterly natural. "I know I can't undo the past," he said, his voice imbued with a newfound strength, a purpose he hadn't felt in decades. "But I want to be a father to you now, Clara. I want to help you achieve every dream you have. A real home. Security. A family." He squeezed her hand gently. "The family you deserved all along." Clara, still overwhelmed by the monumental shifts in her world, looked down at the napkin map in her other hand. It was no longer just a faded drawing, a desperate clue to a lost past. It was a promise, a beacon, a symbol of a home she was finally finding. Before she could fully process the weight of his words, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the small apartment, jarring them both back to the harsh present. The air in Clara's small apartment, moments ago thick with the fragile promise of reconnection, shattered with a series of sharp, authoritative knocks. It was not a tentative rap, but a demand, a familiar punctuation to Clara's often disrupted life. Before either Art or Clara could move, the door swung inward with a decisive push, banging against the wall. Standing on the threshold, a formidable silhouette against the drab hallway, was Uncle Silas. His face was a mask of stern concern, etched with the familiar lines of practical worry. His gaze, sharp and assessing, swept across the room, taking in Art's worn clothes, his quiet presence, and Clara's tear-streaked face. A flicker of judgment, cold and immediate, ignited in his eyes. He saw a drifter, a vagabond, taking advantage of his niece, a young woman already burdened by too many dreams. Silas took a deliberate step into the room, his presence instantly shrinking the already cramped space. "Clara, what is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice a low rumble of accusation, his eyes fixed on Art. "And who is this man?" "I was just coming to remind you about the job offer. You can't afford these distractions." He waved a dismissive hand towards Art, encompassing his entire being in the gesture. "Look at him. What could he possibly offer you? A truck driver by the looks of it. Living on the road, no stability, no future. This isn't the life I've tried to build for you, Clara. You need a steady job, a real future, not some pipe dream with a man who has nothing but empty promises." His words were a weapon, honed by years of perceived wisdom, cutting into the tender moment Art and Clara had just shared. A strange calm settled over Clara, a strength she hadn't known she possessed rising within her. The shame and fear that had often accompanied her uncle's visits vanished, replaced by a fierce protective defiance. She straightened, placing herself firmly between Art and Silas, her small frame radiating an unexpected authority. "You don't understand, Uncle," she said, her voice clear and resonant, startling Silas with its conviction. "This isn't a distraction. This isn't a pipe dream." She turned, her eyes meeting Art's, a silent promise passing between them. "Uncle Silas," she declared, her voice ringing with an undeniable truth, "this is Arthur Vance. He's my father." Silas's face, usually so composed, crumpled in astonishment. His jaw dropped, his eyes wide with disbelief, the carefully constructed world of his pragmatism momentarily shattered by the sheer, impossible weight of her words. Clara, emboldened, reached for the crumpled napkin, its familiar lines now imbued with a new, sacred power. "This map, Uncle," she said, holding it up, her finger tracing the faint A.V. initials near the old oak tree. "He drew it. For me. 20 years ago, before he left." Art stepped forward, his gaze unwavering, adding his voice to hers. "I taught her to fish in that creek," he said, pointing to a swirl on the napkin. "She loved climbing that old oak. I drew this so she'd always find her way back, even if I couldn't be there." Silas stared, his eyes darting from the map to Art's earnest face, then to Clara's resolute expression. The details, the raw emotion, the undeniable truth woven into the simple drawing, it was too much. His pragmatic world, built on tangible facts and logical choices, offered no defense against the heart-shattering reality before him. He began to visibly falter, his certainty eroding. The fight drained from Silas, leaving him looking suddenly diminished. He had come to fix a problem, to impose order, but what he found was an emotional truth too profound for his calculations. He offered a mumbled, almost inaudible apology, a rare crack in his stoic facade. I suppose I was mistaken," he muttered, his gaze still avoiding Art's. He turned, his shoulders slumping, and walked stiffly towards the door. Without another word, he let himself out, closing the door softly behind him, the sound a gentle sigh of surrender. The tension that had coiled in the room slowly unwound, replaced by a quiet, burgeoning peace. Art and Clara looked at each other, a profound understanding passing between them. The external threat had receded, leaving them in the sanctity of their newfound connection, their hands finding each other, a silent promise of a future finally found. A soft gray light filtered through the small, grimy window of Clara's apartment, marking the arrival of a new, impossibly changed morning. Arthur Vance, the weary truck driver whose life had been a solitary rumble of highway miles, moved with an uncharacteristic quietness in the tiny kitchen. The scent of brewing coffee, a simple act of domesticity he hadn't performed for a family in decades, filled the air, a stark contrast to the grease and grit of his usual mornings. Clara watched him from the worn armchair, a threadbare blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes, red-rimmed from the tears of the previous night, held a mix of wonder and trepidation. This man, a stranger just days ago, was her father. The truth was still a fragile, breathtaking thing. "Cream? Sugar?" Art's voice was gruff, but held a tender edge she hadn't noticed before. He placed a steaming mug on the small table beside her, his calloused hand hovering for a moment before retreating. They talked of small things. The weather, the diner's morning rush, the surprising quiet of the city at dawn, slowly, carefully, bridging the chasm of 20 lost years with hesitant words and shared silences. Each glance, each quiet breath, was a tentative step on a new, uncharted road. The coffee warmed Clara's hands, but it was Art's presence that truly began to thaw the chill of her long-held solitude. She looked down at the pile of career brochures on her lap, old dreams that had felt impossible just yesterday. "I always thought maybe I could study something. Design. Or even city planning," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. as if testing the words aloud for the first time. Art, seated opposite her, leaned forward, his eyes no longer haunted by regret, but alight with a fierce, newfound purpose. "Then you will," he stated, his voice firm, unwavering. "Whatever it is, Clara, you will. I'll make sure of it." His words were not just an offer of help, they were a promise, a vow etched in the lines of his weathered face. He saw her future not as a burden, but as his own redemption, a chance to rebuild not just a life, but a legacy of love he had once abandoned. He would support her, fully, completely, ensuring that the dreams she had quietly nurtured in the shadows could now blossom in the sun. Clara looked at him, a hesitant hope blooming in her chest, a belief that this time, this father, would stay. The rumble of Art's rig, once a symbol of his solitary escape, now felt like an invitation. He took Clara for a drive that afternoon, not on a long-haul route, but along scenic coastal roads, the kind he'd always longed to share. Clara, wide-eyed in the passenger seat, watched the world unfold through the vast windshield. Art pointed out landmarks, told stories of the road, the best breakfast spots, the strangest characters he'd met, the breathtaking sunrises over distant plains. His stories were rough-hewn, honest, and filled with a quiet joy she'd never heard from him before. Clara laughed, a clear, unrestrained sound that filled the cab, chasing away the ghosts of lonely miles. She felt a deeper connection to her father's world, a sense of belonging to this vast, open country that was now theirs to explore together. The road, which had once divided them, now forged an unbreakable bond, carrying them forward into a shared future. Art, with the quiet determination of a man making amends, used the savings he'd amassed over decades of solitary work to secure a small, cozy house. It had a patch of overgrown garden in the back, a hopeful space Clara immediately envisioned filled with flowers. Moving in together was a tangible sign of their new life, a foundation laid brick by loving brick. The worn furniture from Clara's apartment found new purpose, and the air, once thick with the scent of old coffee and regret, now smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. Clara, with reverence, found the perfect spot for the hand-drawn map. It was no longer a frantic search for a lost past, but a cherished family heirloom, framed and hung proudly on the living room wall, a testament to the journey that had brought them home. Art, watching her arrange a small bouquet of wildflowers on the table, felt a warmth spread through him that no amount of money or luxury could ever buy. This was his home, and this was his family. That evening, as the last rays of sunset painted the living room in hues of orange and gold, Clara walked over to Art. In her hand, she held the old engraved pocket watch, the one that bore his initials. She gently placed it in his palm, a silent gesture of forgiveness and acceptance. "This map," she began, her voice soft but clear, "it's not just about finding you anymore, Dad. It's a guide to our future, to everything we're going to build, together." Art's eyes, suddenly glistening, looked from the watch to his daughter's earnest face. The weight of 20 years lifted from his shoulders, replaced by a profound, soul-deep peace. He pulled her into a gentle embrace, holding her close, a father finally reunited with his child. The map on the wall, once a faded relic of a broken promise, now shone as a beacon of enduring love, a compass pointing them toward an unbreakable future. Months melted into a tapestry of healing and new beginnings. On a sun-drenched morning, the sprawling campus of a local community college hummed with the energy of ambition. Clara Bell, no longer defined by the relentless churn of a diner shift, moved through its halls with a purposeful stride, a stack of textbooks clutched in her arms. She was pursuing a degree in horticulture, a passion that had bloomed in the small garden Art had helped her cultivate at their new home. Her face, once etched with exhaustion, now radiated a quiet joy. Arthur Vance, her father, a man once lost to the endless highway, was now a fixture in her new routine. He waited patiently in his familiar, albeit now cleaner, truck, a proud, almost shy smile playing on his lips as she emerged. He'd found local work, driving for a small delivery company, allowing him to be present, to witness the blossoming of the life he almost lost. He watched her wave goodbye, a profound contentment settling in his chest. This was a different kind of long haul, one that felt like coming home with every mile. The scent of honeysuckle drifted through the garden of their small house, a testament to Clara's newfound solace. One afternoon, a familiar, somewhat stiff figure appeared at the gate. Uncle Silas. He still carried the air of practical concern, but the hard edges had softened. He held a small, potted rosemary bush, a peace offering that felt both awkward and deeply sincere. He cleared his throat, avoiding Art's gaze, then Clara's. "Heard you were settling in," Silas mumbled, handing Clara the plant. "Good to see you. Thriving." He looked at Art then, a flicker of something akin to respect in his eyes. "Art, I was wrong. About a lot of things. About you. About what truly matters." Art, usually a man of few words, simply nodded, a gentle, understanding smile on his face. The chasm that had separated them, born of practicality versus sentiment, began to bridge, not with grand gestures, but with the quiet acknowledgement of a shared, complicated love for Clara. The roar of the engine, once a mournful symphony of escape, now sang a different tune. Art occasionally took Clara on short trips, the truck no longer a lonely vessel but a shared adventure. They traversed scenic routes, the vast landscapes unfolding before them like the pages of a beloved book. The old hand-drawn map, once a solitary guide to a lost past, now lay open between them on the dashboard, a cherished artifact. They traced its familiar lines, not to uncover what was lost, but to plan new explorations, new memories to forge. "Remember that old diner, Dad?" Clara would laugh, pointing to a smudge on the map. "We should go back sometime, just for old time's sake." Art would chuckle, his eyes twinkling. The road, which had once symbolized his greatest regret, had transformed into a vibrant pathway of connection, each mile a testament to their enduring, rediscovered bond. Their journey, it was clear, was only just beginning. As dusk painted the sky in hues of orange and violet, Arthur Vance settled onto the porch swing, its gentle creak a lullaby to his soul. He watched Clara, humming softly, tending her vibrant garden, her hands deftly coaxing life from the soil. The sight filled him with a profound, almost overwhelming peace. For 20 years he had carried the crushing weight of his past, the ghost of a choice made in desperation, the ache of a broken promise. He had chased the phantom of freedom on endless highways, believing that true wealth lay in anonymity, in escaping responsibility. But now, he understood. The true treasure was here, in the rhythmic beat of a shared life, in the quiet joy of watching his daughter flourish. He was no longer a man adrift. He was anchored, rooted in the rich soil of family. The long haul was over. He had finally found his way home, not on a map, but in the heart of his child. The story of Arthur and Clara reminds us that some journeys, no matter how long or how winding, are destined to bring us home. It is a powerful testament to the unwavering resilience of the human spirit and the enduring belief in second chances. The hand-drawn map, once a fragile whisper of a lost past, became the unwavering compass to a profound reunion, guiding a father and daughter back to each other, mending a family torn apart by circumstance and regret. Their tale speaks to the truth that true legacies are not built on the absence of mistakes, but on the courage to confront them, to seek forgiveness, and to rebuild with the unbreakable threads of love. It tells us that the greatest riches are not found in the miles traveled alone, but in the shared path home. If this story of loss and reunion touched your heart, please let us know in the comments below. What would you have done in Art's position? Don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who appreciates a story about the enduring power of family. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that will move you, inspire you, and remind you of the extraordinary stories hidden within ordinary lives.